Hi guys, now that you've mastered the left hand only, which is the first half of Jamaican Jive, we're going to add all 3 fingers of our right hand down the bottom. 1, 2, 3. This is D. Keep your fingers in this position. This is how the second half of Jamaican Jive begins. D D D D D D D E E E D D D D D D D E D D D D D D D E E E D D D D D D D E. Well done. Just take a moment to make sure that you've still got your thumb feeling the hole there, that your top finger's covering up the top hole. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Let's go again. D D D D D D D E E E D D D D D D D E D D D D D D D E E E D D D D D D D E. And that is the second half of Jamaican Jive.